Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to Front Porch Philosophers. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Michael Granato.
What's happening, spooky folks?
And Raymond Ferrier.
What's up, guys? Happy Halloween.
Today is a very special edition. We're going to talk about ghosts and ghouls and everything paranormal for our holiday bonus track. So,
not everything paranormal.
Yeah, not everything paranormal.
We're going to pace ourselves. Just ghosts.
Just immediately undercut me.
We tried to get Mike on board with that, but he limited us to ghosts. So
yeah, just one BS topic at a time.
All right, well, we know where Mike stands.
All right, well, let's start with ghosts. You got something you want to say about that, Mike?
I ain't afraid of no ghosts.
That's right. You're supposed to say it. And we can't afford the Ghostbusters soundtrack. Or I was thinking of like the X-Files
licensing agreement.
Yeah, but we don't want to get sued because all of us are philosophers and therefore have no money.
No money. Right.
They wouldn't sue us. They'd just make us take it off our podcast. Besides, like the 35 people that will listen to this episode.
Yeah, don't report us.
I'm sure they won't report us if we decide to use something like that.
So I'm going first.
Go ahead. What do you have to say
well,
about
let's just begin with a head count of who believes in ghosts.
That's gonna be a real easy head count.
Jared
believes in ghosts.
No, I don't. Raymond.
And my wife is suspicious that there may be ghosts out in the world.
What? Why?
Bring her on. Bring her on.
She's in Wisconsin right now.
Oh, so. Yeah, that's right. She's doing real work, real paying work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we can ridicule her in her absence.
Michael, your wife has to have a belief in something spooky like ghosts or the paranormal, right?
So my wife was a hospice nurse for a number of years. And yes, she does have some strange stories, but I take a very hard-nosed approach to all this, and I deny the existence of anything paranormal because I'm a dyed-in-the-wool naturalist.
Gotcha. So let's then break down the two camps, because it's a very weird thing when you think of it philosophically. The people who say they believe in ghosts or some paranormal, aspect of our existence, but who in other ways and in other, aspects of their like life and their thinking are very much like non-religious per se, or just they're not inclined to think in terms of what would be some sort of like meta reality, and yet they will abide ghost in their ways of looking at the world.
Mike, you got some sort of numbers on this, don't you? Isn't there wasn't there like a recent poll or study done of average Americans and their beliefs about paranormal?
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. You could easily look it up. So Gallup, the famous Gallup poll, does numbers on this every few years. I think the last poll was from 2014-ish, I believe, but it's still close, and it's only Americans. They only polled Americans, but it's still close to half of Americans believe in ghosts.
Crazy, right?
It's in the like upper 40s. It's not quite 50%, but it's in the upper 40s. I remember that much.
Yeah,
and I think that number probably jumps if you're talking about people willing to like spend the night in the graveyard or something. Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
You have people who are like, "Oh no, I don't believe in ghosts," and you're like, "Would you spend the night in the graveyard?" And they're like, "Nope, no, thank you."
Nope.
I'll
No,
tell you
thank you.
what, I tell you what I thought was interesting about that poll, and it kind of goes along with what Raymond was saying. Um, so there has been an increase in the United States, at least. I can't speak for other countries. I have no idea what goes on there, but in the United States, at least, there has been an increase in belief in the paranormal, and not a belief in religious belief. So the two don't necessarily coincide. Like, I think we should start off by making a distinction between religious belief and belief in the paranormal, because one of the things I thought was interesting about that latest poll is that belief in ghosts and haunted houses has gone up, while belief in things like Satan or other like religious entities like angels has either remained stagnant, or in the case of like Satan, gone down. So, and that's just in the United States, and that's just one poll. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt, take it as you will. But belief in paranormal has certainly gone up.
I suspect that there would be more of a correlation between belief in paranormal activity and something like UFOs than there would be between paranormal activity and religion, or things that you could broadly see as kind of occultish religion, like hoodoo beliefs and things like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting world we live in. It's almost this weird tension between these paranormal shows that are so popular and the like science illiteracy that we have out in America. It's just another like damning piece of evidence that we need to bolster our science education in our
Yeah,
country.
I mean, do you?
Yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? Do you think that we have all these paranormal shows because it's tapping into some latent set of beliefs, or do you think that they're driving this uptick in belief? I suspect that it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. A little bit of both. I mean, it's definitely. There's no doubt that I don't believe in ghosts, but then at the same token, when I'm like walking around in Mississippi, which if you're not familiar with Mississippi, there's a lot of trees here, um, lots of trees, and when it's dark and it's like fall and there's like leaves off the trees and lights casting through these bare trees with all these shadows, it's creepy for sure. So it gets back to this sort of like deep evolutionary like paranoia of like being in the woods or being outside and
Oh
in
yeah.
situations that are like just unsettling to you existentially because you're concerned about your survival. But generally speaking, when I think of those moments, I'm more concerned about like the random serial killer that decided to stalk me that night instead of some other poor
Right.
soul down the road. Um,
Which is
but yeah, I mean, you could
just about as
easily see
irrational,
people
but
just about as irrational. Yeah, right.
I can't remember who I heard talking, but I was listening to a conversation about this recently, and they said something very similar. Like, I'll use myself as an example. Um, I don't believe in ghosts, but there you have to take into consideration like you said, Raymond, the evolutionary history of this. We are evolutionary designed to sense danger, and it's better to falsely sense danger, i.e., like somebody looking at us from behind, or we think somebody's looking at us behind, than for us not to sense that danger and be killed. So it's a benefit for us to be afraid and to be on edge, because that means we're more likely to survive. So you have to take into account that, and also just the psychological aspect of it. Um,
Yeah, certainly.
I probably should have looked this up before we started, because I'm just kind of
why would
blowing
we
hot air.
research the things that we talk
Yeah,
about, Michael?
I don't, whatever. But
Right.
there has actually been studies on this, and I don't know the name of the study. I don't know what school did it, but you can basically kind of prep people, or like warm people up into a ghost experience. Like,
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, this is exactly what happens when you have psychics and stuff. I mean, like first off, you look for gullible people, right? This is the so-called Barnum effect, right? So there's this. You have to look for a certain sort of person which is kind of looking to be deceived, right? So people that go have a tarot reading, for example, these are people who are primed to believe whatever they're told because they're going there for the experience of. If you go to a haunted house, you don't want to leave going, I didn't see anything, right? I mean, part of the allure of going is to have some sort of experience. And so people look for ways. They willfully interpret things as being paranormal or supernatural. Like if you find out that someone was murdered in a house that you live in or something, that might creep some people out. I've lived in a house where someone was murdered and it didn't bother me at all. Um, and man, I paid less for the house. um,
Nice.
it's terrible.
I know, but the thing is, like, I mean, some people would be worried about like supernatural entities hanging about as if which has never made much sense to me because I'm pretty sure that if I was murdered, my aura wouldn't just want to like stay in the place in which I was murdered. This is part of the problem with psychics too. It's like it's not just ghosts these days, but you have all of these like necromancer shows.
So I think that what we need to do then, because we are talking about philosophy and ghosts, right, of the paranormal, we need to talk about I think the underlying sort of philosophical, sort of like meta narrative ideas that are involved with this way of thinking about the world where there are spirits and ghosts left behind. And then I know perhaps to your dismay and frustration, I think it would be a fun thought experiment to consider um, perhaps some new ways of thinking about what ghosts could be outside of like a metaphysical description of them, which is what I'm thinking of when I think of like traditionally understanding ghost. So this
Mhm.
idea of like energy left behind from human beings, some sort of weird form of like transhumanism, that type of stuff, right? And whether or not that's possible or within the scope of like a naturalistic way of talking about quote unquote ghosts, sort of like redefining the term. Does that sound good?
Uh, I feel like I should give some kind of like I should qualify this a little bit and say that we're kind of bashing on belief in ghosts pretty harshly here, and I will be bashing on it throughout this episode. But I do want to say that most cultures throughout most of history have held some sort of belief in ghosts or spirits or like ancestor veneration. The idea that the people that we love who have passed still remain here on this earth in some way, shape, or form is almost universal. I mean, you find that in
Yeah,
most every culture across the globe. Um,
absolutely.
take your pick of which geographical location you want to go with. What I think is interesting from a historical perspective is how that belief has changed and what we mean by ghost and what we think of when we think of ghost is not necessarily what people of the past would have thought of when they thought of ghost.
Yeah,
Because for us, ghosts have a somewhat like malevolent aura to them. And ghosts
yeah,
are
yeah,
like a very significant part of like horror movies, and you have ghost stories, the intent of which is to scare people. But that hasn't always been the case. And the idea of like haunting and
yeah,
the idea of like ghost seeking like revenge or like out to get the living is relatively recent. I think it has its roots in the Victorian era, especially in the United States and Britain and Europe in the 19th century. But I just kind of wanted to make that qualifier to say that, there is definitely a historical dimension to this.
yeah. It'd be nice to have like an understanding of the linguistics there too, because it seems like the
Mhm.
etymology, like where did the term ghost come from? It seems very different than the term spirit, which you
Right.
know suggest more of a sort of like powerful entity left on Earth that could be bad or good, whereas ghosts have become sort of almost derogatorily like either bad or sort of like a joke when you think of somebody like Casper the ghost, right? The friendly ghost,
Yeah,
right? So you
yeah,
have to like qualify that he's a friendly ghost as opposed to, something else. So that's interesting. Then there is that historical component and the afterlife. So that transitions well into the metaphysical approach to reality and the belief in some sort of meta reality that exists apart from the physical material world that we experience on a day-to-day basis. It's only natural that when we think of like, concepts like God, um, these sort of transcendental ideas that sort of shape our understanding of these forms of existence that are supposed to be there underneath reality or sort of, as the sort of law and construct of reality. It's only natural that then you would think in terms of a soul.
mm-hmm,
You would ask questions about the immortality of the soul once, people died, because if there is some sort of meta reality that's, contained within the vessel of a human being, then it would seem reasonable to ask the question, well, does that individual exist beyond their physical death? And then, of course, when you get into the religious and occult, those develop into more fixed and like sophisticated discussions about death and immortality and the possibility of living now and afterwards. And, they get interpreted in different ways. But that's I think what people who believe in ghosts for the most part, even today, are thinking in those terms of some sort of extra reality that's not physical or sensible, right? Some super
right.
sensible reality.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, these concepts are kind of tied at the hip with something like a Platonic worldview. I mean, when we think of this in a religious context, we obviously think about the question of can one survive death? And then what is an afterworld for and what does it look like? And I think there are some historical reasons why discussions of an afterlife emerged when they did. And that's an interesting topic off to itself. But in terms of where ghost stories come from, within the United States, there was an explosion in supernaturalism post Civil War. And that had to do with, how many people died in the Civil War? Something like 600,000 people. I mean, that's a significant portion of the population at the time. And so you see the emergence of all this occultism in the decade or so following the Civil War because people were trying to commune with the dead. And then you basically had tricksters, right, who'd go around and they created all of these, they would have seances and all of these different things to commune with the dead. And it's really just a means of providing some false comfort to the mourning, which I don't have any problem necessarily with someone wanting to provide some sort of narrative to help people deal with their suffering. The problem is, this sort of thing manipulates people and it's usually for profit, which is the issue that I take with the kind of like modern day necromancers, right? These people who have TV shows where they gather a group of people and then they commune with the dead. These sort of psychics are there to take people's money. And it's not just anyone's money that they're taking, right? They're taking the money of people who are typically dealing with great suffering or grief. And I think that's quite morally objectionable. So it's one thing to have like a ghost hunter show where people go around and pretend like they, like infrared cameras pretending that they see paranormal activity. I mean, you can laugh at that sort of stuff. But when you have someone who stands up in front of a room full of people and says, someone from the other side just wants you to know that they're okay, while that message may be comforting, I think we've mentioned before, I think someone would be better off seeing like a licensed therapist to deal with those issues rather than talking to someone who's pretending to talk to their dead relatives.
Now, can I bring us into the philosophical discussion?
By all means,
Is that okay with y'all?
that's what we're here for.
So I am going to start off with a very hard-nosed approach, and then you can come at me with whatever you want to. But I would say not only do I not believe in ghosts, but I would say the idea of a ghost, the idea of a, we could call it a conscious entity, a I mean, it would have to be, on some level, it would have to be conscious. The idea of a disembodied consciousness that exists outside of a, well, I mean, I was about to say outside of a physical body, but that's the definition of disembodied. The idea of a disembodied consciousness existing, I would say, is very close to impossible.
I agree.
That was supposed to be controversial.
It's not. The reason why is because, again, I think that philosophical dualism in the West, at least, goes back to Plato. But there's a dual trajectory in something like Western Christianity in particular, in terms of the influence of Aristotle versus the influence of Plato. And so Platonic Christianity kind of preserves this dual world mentality. And some of that is also located in the conception of the soul. And so the body is kind of a home for the soul. And so there's some contradistinction there. But in the Aristotelian influence that you see, and you see it in a certain sort of philosophy, like it's difficult to say that the Apostle Paul was an Aristotelian, but clearly his worldview seems to have something in mind like hylomorphism, right? So that hylomorphic worldview is essentially that a soul is just kind of an enlivened body, right? So this is the reason why in Pauline Christianity, the resurrection is so important. Because a resurrection, it doesn't seem strictly necessary if it was a more Platonic form, right? So if the body is just something that carries around the soul, then why couldn't you have a disembodied soul, right? What would the cause and need be for a resurrection? Well, because for someone like Paul, and then of course for someone like Aristotle, it doesn't make any sense to talk about a soul without a body. And so I think you see both tendencies running through Christianity up through the present, even though these days, especially since Descartes and modernity, kind of a certain kind of dualism took over most of modernity until the 20th century, where you had critics like Gilbert Ryle and his whole critique about the ghost in the machine and whatnot has kind of laid to waste some of Cartesian dualism. But it remains kind of out there, I would say, a more traditional Christian understanding that this notion of kind of a body carrying around a soul, which can escape the soul and then go live off on its own to be reunited with the body at some later stage, doesn't make much sense. It certainly is. It certainly doesn't make sense in terms of Christian scripture.
Jared, I want to interrupt you here and just say that your comparison between the Apostle Paul and Aristotle really touched me deep in my soul, because when I feel vindicated, because when I was an undergrad, I was taking an upper level philosophy class in human nature, and I made the exact same argument with Paul and Aristotle at that time. And the two professors that were co-teaching it, one was a philosopher and one was a religion professor, and they both just ultimately crapped on the idea and thought it was wrong. So
Well, that means that, to my mind, that means they either don't know Paul or they don't know Aristotle.
yeah, that
Or
would
the
be
two were not even remotely connected.
whatever.
I'm not saying that. No.
I'm not saying
that
the historical connection is there. I'm saying you can make a constructive argument that there's something to be said there.
It's pretty clear the Apostle Paul has read philosophy. In particular, he has read the Stoics. I mean, Stoicism runs through Pauline thought. And so I don't think it's beyond the pale to think that Paul was at least conversant in Aristotelian ideas. And even if he didn't know it directly, it's kind of in the water in terms of the thinking in the Near East at that time, that this is one dominant conception of thinking about the relationship of mind and body, if you can even talk about those as separate things.
Yeah.
I mean, it also leads, I think that this conception also eventually leads to a kind of Gnosticism, right? Where you disparage the body because the body is kind of a prison. And that's exactly what you see in the development of the influence of Plato kind of run wild in the second and third century Christianity, where you have what we would now call Christian heretics, people like Valentinus. But I mean, orthodoxy only developed in relation and conversation with these people, so it's a little unfair to say. I mean, from a modern Christian perspective, they're certainly heretics, but they would have been within the broad camp of Christianity at the time. But there's a lot of speculation amongst Gnostic-minded thinkers, and a lot of that speculation centers on disparaging body and talking about rising to different levels of spiritual knowledge and whatnot. And that's just something that you don't encounter in a thinker which has more grounding, right? A grounding in a physical body. And that's what I think you get in discussing Paul. And really the traditions which follow that sort of trajectory. I think that you can see, Thomas Aquinas is obviously, he obviously advocates holomorphism as well. And he is, of course, reading directly Augustine and Augustine's commentators. I mean, not Augustine, Aristotle and Aristotle's commentators.
This seems to be a very Western idea, the idea of ghosts, at least in the way that it's become sort of this like popular motif in culture, more so than what we see and read about in other cultures and traditions in different parts of the world. And it could be that, as you were saying, Jared, that it's somehow tied to this Greek Christian overlap.
Yeah, but I don't really know how much that has to do with the modern idea of what a ghost is or isn't.
Frankly, I think a lot of it comes down to like popular media. I think how a lot of it is communicated, especially recently, right? So almost all of our conceptions right now about what a ghost looks like and how the ghost behaves and stuff, you can probably trace it back a bit to late 19th, early 20th century artwork, and then carried over into cinema. And then in cinema, of course, there's all of these tropes now that we have about how to tell a ghost story or how to tell a horror film or whatnot. And they follow familiar patterns now. And sometimes the limits gets pushed in one direction or the other about what a ghost can look like and whatnot. But ultimately, there's a lot of the same resonances. And I think that has more to do with just kind of keeping with the audience's expectations of what they're supposed to look for in a ghost story. And sometimes it's consciously subverted.
Do you think it's not grounded in the sort of metaphysical culture and tradition like the Greek and the Christian, or do you think it's just like based on this more like what we were talking about at the beginning of this, like this existential concern about the afterlife and death and the possibility of something like, a ghost coming up behind you when you're walking around in the dark?
I would say that I think a lot of it has to do with folk stories more so than formal metaphysical dialogue. So, I mean, this is why this is kind of problematic trying to trace some of this through Western philosophers, because I don't think that most philosophers would recognize the validity of it. It feels like old wives' tales, right? And it feels like it has the same sort of resonance which emerged in folk stories and repeated because, they're the stuff of children's nightmares, right? They're the tales that we learn when we're kids, and then they're preserved. And I mean, if you want to try to psychoanalyze these, I'm sure that you can say there's something innate in all of these things. But ultimately, I feel like the tropes are built upon these kind of folk stories.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, like you said, Jared, I don't think, you're if you do like a search through Western philosophy about ghosts, it's probably not going to come up that much. What I think you would have to do, what you'd be better off doing, is instead looking at the concept like the metaphysics of like mind or the metaphysics of soul. But even then, you're not going to, you'd be hard pressed to find a 20th, 21st century philosopher that takes those ideas seriously, metaphysically speaking.
I'm not
Correct
talking
me if
about
I'm
like
wrong.
I'm not talking about like professional philosophers talking about this in any great way. I'm just saying it's the context in which the West, developed was in light of Platonic Christian motifs and themes, regardless of whether or not somebody can articulate them in any, intellectual or professional way like we can. It doesn't mean that they're not working with those assumptions, right? That's all I'm
Yeah.
asking.
Maybe. I mean, well, I wonder about this. Like, is it the case that these ideas originate with someone like Plato or Aristotle? I mean, those are divergent ideas. Is it the case that they originate there and then they disseminate in the culture in kind of corrupted form? Or is the case that these are basic dispositions and that what you see in emergent in someone like Plato or Aristotle is a more refined form? So, which is, is it a chicken and egg problem?
I think
So
it's the
maybe
latter.
you
I
think
think you're.
so?
I think because I definitely think that we can admit that there's some sort of existential
Yeah.
concern, something that's not mediated by like cultural thinking and concepts from Greek philosophers, but that's just a part of like being human and being scared and paranoid about things that could threaten your existence, whether they're physical or not physical. Probably fits into the same scheme of like the knowledge in the gaps, right? Like you don't know why this door slammed certain times when you are walking around your house, but it's very likely that if a scientist was there 200-300 years ago, they would say, well, it's air pressure changes when somebody opens this window and it's at this temperature of the day, and then this door gets open or closed, and then all of a sudden this door gets slammed shut. In a different time, when people don't understand fluid dynamics and how air works in that way, then they're going to say, oh, there's grandma. It's like a weird combination, I'm sure, of existential concern about our existence, but also filling in the gaps where we don't have knowledge, right?
I think that
Yeah.
this is a good place to mention. Have either of you guys ever read Lord of the Flies?
Yeah.
Um, I'm rereading it at the moment. It's an interesting idea because what you see is a group that begins by dismissing these sort of supernaturalistic explanations in terms of like the little kids are afraid of beasts living on the island, and the older kids say things like, that can't possibly be the case. On a small island, you don't have large animals, those sorts of things. And then approaching it from a scientific, an expressly scientific perspective, right? They even name it as such, right? That the world operates according to these laws. But then by the end, just kind of a series of events playing themselves out in the natural world starts to shake the foundation of that. And then many of the children revert back to what you can see as a more primal understanding, right? Which is just paranoia about the unknown.
Right.
And then they look for things which end up substantiating, right, this sort of paranoia. And so I think it's interesting to point out that, yeah, it's easy for us in the 21st century sitting comfortably, in electronically lit rooms to denigrate things like human paranoia. But it becomes more difficult if you're exposed to the dangers and uncertainties of nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very true.
And I would say, I would also add to your point, Raymond, like, I mean, I'm sure Plato and Aristotle had a part to play, but this sort of like animistic thinking about the world that's evident in basically like all primal religions. I mean, and these primal religions have been around as long as there have been humans, right?
At least
So
40,000 years, yeah.
yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
you go all the way back, human beings first appeared 300,000 years ago, right? Even like Neanderthals had probably had some sort of concept of religion, loosely speaking, I would say. So yeah, human beings, even if we take Jared's number, 40,000 years ago, that's still
Well, the only reason I say 40,000 years ago is because we actually have statues, right? We actually
sure.
have,
Venus
um,
of Willendorf.
we have like Venus statues, which we think are not just like pornographic in nature, but actually are
Right.
supposed to be like amulets or something.
So even if we take that date, you're still looking at 40,000 BC. So until Plato is what, third century, fourth century
Mhm.
BC,
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. So for, 35,000 years, this is how human beings thought of the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty deep down in there for us.
Yeah. And it gets shaped though in different ways though, because I think that in studying other religious traditions, since we teach world religions, um, and are required to know these things. It definitely seems like, and not to say that the Western world doesn't have this, but in African religions and in Asiatic religions, you see these turning points in society and history where we focus more on, there's like this shift. You either going to go, it seems like you're going to go sort of like this idea of ghosts and like non-embodied people, or you're going to go in the direction of this person has been possessed by a demon, or there's the presence of like a good or bad spirit. The individual, as an individual that you would know, kind of dissipates from having any sort of earthly or worldly presence and any understandings. They may be like in the stars or some other plane of existence watching down on you, kind of thing. But as far as like actively participating in this world, like demon or your good spirit, bad spirit, that type of thing, right? So it's a different way of thinking about things, because it's just a different evolution of ideas, I think.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
the science behind it is the interesting thing, I think. The question about the science behind it, the with the iteration, the new research into things like quantum mechanics, and the world in a way that is sensible, whether or not Michael's shaking his head right now because he knows this is bullshit, but whether or not there could be some red of energy left behind by an individual, in a sort of like transhumanism approach. No thoughts on that at all? No, like,
I mean,
interest in that?
I have a lot of thoughts about it. Yeah.
Most of them
No, like,
derogatory.
No, it's not
no,
even
like,
that.
interesting
So
speculations.
I don't even think it's all that interesting. And this is why I say that. I mean, it's fun to talk about.
It is
I mean,
fun to talk
I
about.
love a good ghost story, and I will watch ghost videos on YouTube. Like, that's what I do for Halloween. I love it. I love it. But I hear this a lot, and this is usually what I get into arguments with people about, because they don't like my perceived like arrogance. But I don't even think it's all that arrogant. And I had this conversation with our one and only Patreon supporter. Shout out to Mark.
Mark.
Yeah, Mark.
We had this conversation the other night. He said, well, it is theoretically at least possible, right? He said, and I'm not pinning all of this on Mark. Mark, I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting you. Come on the podcast. We can argue that.
He's our only supporter. You can't piss
Yeah. We're going to lose him already. But so I get this a lot when I talk about ghosts or souls or spirits or whatever, right? And I say that it's not possible. And then people immediately push back, like, what do you mean it's not possible? We don't know everything there is to know. Science hasn't reached the end, hasn't discovered everything. So how can you say it's not possible? And I agree with that, right? And science hasn't reached its end. I don't think it'll ever reach its end. There'll always be something that we can scientifically study. What I mean when I say that it's not possible, we don't know everything. That's true. But we have a pretty firm idea of what we know and of what we don't know. There are still some very big questions out there that science has yet to sort of wrap its head around. But so with the progression from Newtonian mechanics, which describes the motion of everyday objects that you see in the room around you. If you throw something up in the air, Newtonian mechanics can describe it, to the advent of relativity theory, which describes really big and or really fast moving objects, like discusses things about the speed of light and the shape of space and all that other good stuff. And quantum mechanics, which discusses really, really, really small objects. So we have, if you look at the base level of reality, we can talk about quantum fields. That's where we're at right now. And there might be other particles that we discover, sure, but those other particles are going to be explainable in terms of quantum fields. So in order to posit that something like a ghost could be real, Now, by real, I understand these people to mean physically real,
Yeah,
materially real.
something
Okay,
measurable,
great, something
Detectable
measurable.
by some sort of like system, like on a ghost show.
Yeah.
some doohickey or
So, in
thingamajig.
order for that thing to be real, well, now you're going to have to talk about what sort of field is it emitting? Is it a strong force? Is it a weak force? And guess what? We know about some forces and we know about some particles, but not only do we know about those things, but we also know about what we don't know about. We don't know about what happens in a black hole or the center of a black hole. We don't know about
Time travel.
dark. Uh, don't don't say that. We don't know about dark energy, and these are things we know we don't know about.
Well,
So
was it Interstellar? That teaches me that if you fall in a black hole, you become a ghost.
Exactly.
I hate both of you. I hate both of you, and I quit. I'm just kidding. Um, so you
Matthew
can,
McConaughey says you become a ghost.
yeah, I will fight Matthew McConaughey in Texas.
I would
will
pay so
definitely
much
lose.
money to watch that. I'd sit in my Lincoln drinking wild turkey and watching you fight a shirtless Matthew McConaughey.
Picking
Yep.
a big. So yeah, I don't think that it's possible because we haven't discovered anything that we know that would make it possible, and we don't theoretically have an idea of anything that would make it possible that we don't know about yet, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's I earlier this week, just so people know, I told Michael I wanted to bring up Stargate because in Stargate, the TV series and movie, if you haven't watched it, you should. It's a sci-fi flick and series.
Very good.
They have quote unquote ascended beings, and so it, the only way that I could perceive of something like what we're talking about, like a ghost or a spirit, you know, left behind without a physical form, would have to be some future technology that would allow human beings to transcend physical existence. But if we were to suppose a Stargate scenario, right, it would not be like a typically natural thing. It would have to be brought upon by science. So the very idea of some sort of like existence in the way that we talk about like being a spirit or being a ghost, the only possible line of avenue I think is if science came up with some ridiculous technology that allowed us to transcend physical existence and somehow maintain our identity in some.
Yeah.
See, I reject the whole transhumanist idea, like that if you could somehow download like if it were physically possible to download one's consciousness into like a mainframe or something like that, in that instance, you would cease to be you, right? Because part of
Yeah,
what it means to be you is to be embodied as a human being. You would cease to be
yeah,
you, even if there was some sort of continuity with your consciousness. I mean, you would be a different entity fairly quickly after that, right? So it's not like you as yourself would be surviving. You would prolong your consciousness through some sort of system, right? You would be
yeah.
increasingly less human the longer you existed in that state.
But
Um,
maybe that's the perfect example of a ghost, just a ghost haunting a computer.
I think you
It's the new
existing as a
transhumanism.
virus, yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly. Right.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Jared. I hate to admit it, but you know, I've
Victory.
heard, yeah, because I like these discussions because transhumanism is like just like Ghost is also something I like to read about and to watch about. But yeah, I just can't conceive of, and people talk about like, oh, well, one day you'll be able to achieve uh, immortality by downloading your consciousness into a computer. Yeah, I'm not convinced. Like, sure, you can download maybe aspects of your personality. You can download I don't even know if you would be able to download memories. That's a whole nother. It, aside from that, like I just don't see it. I don't see how it could possibly be you.
Yeah,
How
Yeah,
it could be the same person.
absolutely.
it's not a great movie, but there's this movie with Johnny Depp called Transcendence,
Oh
and
my God, that was a
it's no,
terrible
no,
movie.
it's not a good movie,
Terrible
but
movie.
it does press this point at the end, which is he becomes once he like fuses his consciousness with the internet, he becomes this really problematic entity. I'm not saying it's a good movie or that anyone should watch it. I'm just saying that it presents this problem, which is you can't just be yourself downloaded into a computer system. And I
Yeah,
want to say one thing about this whole living forever thing as a machine. Let's say that you could, if you could download your consciousness into a machine and then let's say back it up uh, on 100 different hard drives and then send them out into 100 different directions out into the universe so that if something were to happen to one, you some version of yourself would exist forever as it was. This is still forgetting like the heat death of the universe, right? It's
yeah,
not immortality, it's just a prolongation, right? So even if you lived a million years, it's not immortality.
Hmm.
um I know that's a pedantic point, but come on. I mean, nothing is
dude,
forever in this
you've
universe.
you've really been thinking about how you can download your conscious and send it to the edges of the universe, haven't you? I mean,
Yeah,
who
man.
thinks of that? 100 hard drives and then send it in every direction? You spent a lot of time thinking this up, man.
I did analytic philosophy, and as an undergrad, and we spent. I think it was just a program that I was in at the University of Illinois. There was a heavy concentration on philosophy of technology and on philosophy of mind. And so, yes,
Mhm.
I have thought about it a lot because I've read about it a lot. These are so transhumanist ideas. These are like ways of getting around a lot of problems, right?
Yeah,
Is like, oh, well, if you just download one thing, we've all crashed a hard drive, right? So does that mean that you have a second death? Well, not if you have 100 hard drives, right? Now it ends up being 100 different versions of you eventually, right?
yeah,
Because
right.
they
Yeah.
diverge from each other. But it's some sort of prolongation of your consciousness.
Yeah,
But
but
again,
you
it's not immortality.
but if you get captured by the Borg,
Mhm.
Oh my
then
God.
you're in a good
Don't
you're in
forget
good
about the
business there.
Borg.
Don't forget about the Borg,
Resistance is futile. No,
the
I was going to
collective.
say one thing. I didn't say it when Mike brought it up, but I do want to point out this argument where someone says, "Well, look, science hasn't disproven, right, the existence of ghosts or something." That's a classic fallacy, right? That's
Yeah.
argumentum ad ignorantium, right? This appeals to ignorance to say that it's somehow evidence that ghosts could exist just because it has not been demonstrably disproven by science. That's an appeal to ignorance. You could do the same thing with Sasquatch, right? Well, science hasn't definitively disproven that there's an eight black creature roaming the Pacific Northwest. Well, that doesn't mean that there is, right? You need some sort of evidence to support the claim.
Yeah.
Okay, you were going
And
to say
not
something.
not only that, but yeah, it is an argument. It's an appeal to ignorance for sure. And you also run the risk of a sort of God of the gaps type argument.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah, I mean
because
the issue with the God of the Gaps is not just a theological problem, right? It's
it's a
any sort of
scientific problem.
speculation. Yeah,
So you run the same thing. So we've always speculated about what possibly a soul could consist of. And for a long time, you had concepts in science that might lend itself to like a ghost-like substance or a soul-like substance, with the concept of like vitalism, for example, was a big part in like 19th century, early 20th century biology. The idea that there is some sort of like special life force. Um, the problem by proposing that is that the more science progresses, the smaller the likelihood that that could actually be a thing becomes until it's eventually eliminated. And then you're left with just nothing. So
yeah,
it's the same thing with ghosts. Like, well, what if there's like a spirit particle? Okay, cool, but when are we going to find it? because we haven't found it yet, and we found a whole host of particles. What if there's a consciousness particle? Great, but you're just creating like you're just pushing you're pushing the buck back further and further and further and further until you're not left with anything.
Well, I would make the same claim about ghosts that I say whenever I talk about angels, which is to say, could they be real? Maybe. But if they're real, they're non-physical, right? Which means that science has no coverage over them whatsoever. It's non-scientific claim to talk about ghosts or to talk about angels. Maybe they exist on some other plane of reality, but we cannot assess that plane. So there's no use in appealing to, particles or whatnot. And if they exist on some separate plane, whatever access to them we have, I mean, I would effectively say that we don't have access. So what's the point of talking about it?
Yeah. And we have no indication that some other such plane of reality even exists.
Yeah.
Until we go through a black hole.
And you find Matthew McConaughey there.
Oh my gosh.
We'll just call him up and be like, come on, man, what did you really see over there?
Weed.
The great thing about all of this, though, and we should follow this up, we should follow up this episode with a conversation about aliens, because what science can't definitively exclude from possibility at this point is alien life forms, which is a spectacularly great thing.
Okay, I want to say something before I know Mike dives into this, because Mike has lots. He's thought about aliens like I've thought about downloading consciousness.
Genuinely concerned about him being in Area 51.
Yeah, yes, we had to check. We had to check on his safety to make sure he wasn't going to get shot outside the borders of Area 51.
I really, really sincerely wanted to go, and I am not exaggerating that at all. I really want to go, and I will one day.
It's the best image in my mind of him bum rushing the gates of Area 51. I just love it.
Naruto running that.
No, okay. Let me say something about aliens. Just given the vastity of the vastness of the universe, it's highly improbable that we are the only life form out there. Even so, it's not unlikely that we're the only intelligent life form. Here's where this becomes problematic for me, though, in terms of the way people talk about
aliens. Alien talk.
Yeah, don't give the big reveal.
Jeez,
Jesus. Okay, never mind. Just cut that part out.
Dude, in a couple
cut that part out.
But yeah, I do want to talk about aliens, and I also, since it's towards the end of the podcast, I want to mention that my students and I have already talked about aliens and the possibility of aliens with the Drake equation. We also covered the most detailed UFO encounter in the 21st century. And next week, we're talking about ghosts. So shout out to all my SORA students. If you've listened this far, you're going to get extra credit.
How are you going to know that they've listened this far?
Because they will hear me say that you're going to get extra credit. If not, you'll just get basic credit, which is a 1. But if you listen to this, I'll give you a 4.
Okay.
None of my students get extra credit for listening to this.
Why not?
These are required assignments for my students. So
Heck yeah, they are. Where do you think our 4 listeners come from? It's our students that we make listen to it.
Oh well.
Required. Dude.
Are we winding down now?
Yeah. Let's just finish with the conclusion that everybody doesn't want to hear or everybody already thinks. Ghosts just aren't real.
Ghosts don't.
And I would love them. I'd love them to be real. It'd be cool to have a real Ghostbusters team out there.
Well, it would also be nice to know that eternal nothingness doesn't await me after death. That's why I would like for them to be real.
I was going to leave that conclusion out.
Yeah, but see, the ghost thing, that means that you're stuck on Earth to avenge something. And if you're to believe these people on TV, your only thing that you get to do as a ghost is whisper into a psychic's ear the first letter of your last name, so that your family knows that you're okay.
At least I can lie to them and be happy about it.
Yeah, right. I was going to leave that conclusion out
I was
because
murdered.
I thought it was a little bit depressing. depressing. Yeah, right.
It is depressing.
All right. Well,
We
that's
will.
going to have to conclude our discussion, I think. Thanks for joining us. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Deuces.
Peace.
Halloween.
Oh my God. I'm leaving that one in.
Do it.
All right, guys. I got to go.